My name is David Carter, and I am a 34-year-old staff sergeant in the United States Army. I had just stepped off a transport plane after 9 months overseas, carrying the kind of fatigue that sits deep in your bones but holding on to the hope that coming home would make everything feel normal again. When I reached my driveway, the house looked exactly the way I left it, but the moment I opened the door, something in the air felt off. The place was quiet, too quiet, with that stillness that makes you pause without knowing why. I told myself it was just the shock of stepping back into my own life after months of sand, noise, and constant tension, but inside I already felt a pull of unease. Before deployment, Emily and I had a rhythm that I thought was solid. We met during a volunteer event years ago when I was helping recruit for a local veterans program. She had this warmth that made me believe she understood the rough edges of military life. I owned the house long before I met her, a small place I bought after my first re-enlistment using every overtime shift and deployment bonus I could scrape together. The business I ran on the side, a small equipment repair shop near base, was something I built from scratch during weekends and late nights. I took pride in it because it felt like proof that I could build something steady outside the uniform. When Emily moved in, I believed I was offering her stability, not realizing I was giving her access to parts of my life she might someday use against me. Walking through the rooms that first night back, I noticed the small things that did not line up. A stack of unopened mail on the counter that she usually sorted, a missing picture frame from the hallway, and a lingering scent of dinner even though she was nowhere in sight. I tried to shake off the strange feeling creeping up my spine, telling myself I was just readjusting. I had seen conflict before, but nothing in those months abroad had prepared me for the shift I sensed waiting in my own home. I had no idea that while I was overseas protecting the country, the person I trusted the most had been quietly preparing to take everything from me. I knew something was wrong the second I stepped into the dining room that night. The house was dim except for the soft glow above the table, and Emily was sitting there in the center of it like she had been rehearsing the moment. She had a folder in front of her, one of those stiff manila ones people use in offices, and she tapped her pen against it with a rhythm that felt too controlled. I stood in the doorway long enough for her to look up, and the expression on her face hit me harder than any blast I had felt overseas. It was calm, almost businesslike, the kind of look commanders use before they hand out bad news. I walked closer, still carrying the last of my bags, trying to give her the chance to explain, but she slid the folder toward me without a word. I opened it and saw paperwork filled with numbers, signatures, and sections already highlighted. She started talking about fairness and balance, about how she had supported me while I was gone and how she deserved half the house and half the business. Her voice was steady, almost cold, like she had practiced the speech enough times that all emotion had been scraped out of it. I kept reading the documents, feeling my pulse climb as I realized she had already prepared everything for me to sign away what I spent years building. I asked her why she was doing this, but she brushed past the question and pushed a pen in my direction. She talked about starting fresh and making things official, as if she expected me to agree out of simple exhaustion. There was a finality in her tone, something that made it clear she saw this as a negotiation and not a conversation between a husband and a wife. I felt the room closing in on me as I looked at the pages again and tried to steady my breathing. There was no point arguing with someone who had already made up her mind and scripted her lines. I told her nothing. I simply set the pen down, pushed the folder back across the table, and walked out the front door. The silence behind me felt heavier than the pack I carried through deployment. I slept in my truck that night because the idea of going back into that house made my chest tighten. I had faced nights overseas where everything around me was uncertain, but the kind of darkness waiting for me at home was something I never thought I would experience. There was a part of me still hoping it was some kind of misunderstanding, but the look in her eyes told me I was already too late. The next morning, my phone buzzed before the sun was fully up. It was Marcus, the soldier who had been with me through some of the hardest months overseas and one of the few people I trusted without question. He told me to meet him at his place because he had something I needed to see. When I arrived, he had a stack of documents on the table, neatly arranged like evidence ready for inspection. He told me he had kept copies of my property deed and business papers because he knew how often things got misplaced when I deployed. I stared at the documents and felt a wave of confusion mixed with rising anger when I saw the dates. Everything belonged to me long before Emily entered the picture. Marcus explained that Emily had asked questions months ago about ownership and accounts. He had brushed it off at the time, thinking she was curious about legal matters, but now it all made sense to him. The realization hit me slowly, settling like a weight in my stomach. She had not acted out of sudden frustration or disappointment. She had been planning this while I was gone, piece by piece, waiting for the right moment to corner me. The shock was sharp enough to make my throat tighten, and for a moment I could not even speak. That was the moment the first twist settled in. The person I thought I knew had been preparing to take my life apart long before I stepped through the front door. Ethan showed up at my apartment the next evening without calling first, which was unlike him. He worked as a military accountant, the kind of guy who lived by spreadsheets, schedules, and systems, so the unannounced visit alone made my stomach tighten. He walked in holding a thick folder under his arm, and before I could even offer him a drink, he set it on the counter like he was placing evidence at a briefing. I watched him flip it open with the same precision he used when auditing unit budgets, and the seriousness in his expression told me he was not here for a casual update. He pulled out the first stack of papers and told me he had been reviewing some financial activity tied to my accounts because something felt off when Emily contacted him about tax questions weeks earlier. At first I thought he was overreacting, but then he showed me the transfers. Small at the start, then larger amounts, all moved from my personal savings to an account I did not recognize. Each transfer was spaced just far enough apart to look like normal expenses unless someone was paying attention. Ethan pointed out the date range, and I felt anger stir as I realized they lined up with the final months of my deployment. It meant she had started draining my money while I was overseas, without a word, trusting I would be too preoccupied to notice. I tried to keep my voice steady, but every number on the page felt like a strike to the ribs. Then Ethan brought out a receipt from a law office I had never heard of. The payment was made from the shared workspace account I had set up for my side business, the one Emily was never supposed to access. She had used it to pay an attorney retainer, quietly funneling my work funds into her plan. Ethan shook his head and said he only caught it because he remembered me telling him that account was strictly for equipment and repairs. I stared at the receipt, feeling the confusion turn into something heavier as the pattern became harder to ignore. The next section of the folder held property inquiries tied to my father's cabin. That cabin was the one piece of family history I had left after he passed, and Emily had no reason to touch it. Yet there were records showing she had requested appraisals and pulled documents from the state property office. She had even dug into the trust paperwork that protected it. My throat tightened as I flipped through the pages, realizing she was not just going after the house and business. She was aiming for every piece of my life that held value, even the things she knew were tied to my father. Ethan leaned on the counter and told me he did not want to believe it either, but the timeline was clear. She had been laying the groundwork long before I stepped off that plane. I felt the room tilt for a moment as the truth settled in. I had trusted her completely, believing distance and deployment would never shake our foundation. Instead, she had used the time to move in silence, building a plan piece by piece while I was thousands of miles away. The shock of it left me cold, and the anger rising in my chest was sharper than anything I had expected to feel toward the woman I once believed would protect my life as fiercely as I protected hers. Sergeant Jenna called me the morning after Ethan left, her voice tight in a way that made my stomach twist before she even explained why. She told me Emily had reached out to her, saying she was worried about my mental state and hinting that I was having trouble adjusting after deployment. Jenna knew me well enough to sense something was off in the story, but the fact that Emily had gone to her at all felt like another blow. It was the kind of accusation that carried weight in military circles, and it could stain a career if repeated enough times. Hearing Jenna hesitate as she relayed the details made me feel like the ground was shifting under my feet. I tried to explain what was really happening, but even as I talked, I could hear the doubt she was trying to hide. Not because she believed Emily, but because Emily had framed her concern in a way that made questioning her seem cold. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed feeling the pressure close in. I had faced firefights and long nights where every sound meant danger, yet somehow this felt harder to control. There was no clear enemy here, only whispers moving behind my back. Later that afternoon, my mother called, sounding confused and uneasy. She asked why Emily wanted information about the deed to my father's cabin and whether something had happened that she should know about. My mother was gentle by nature, someone who avoided conflict, so for her to ask directly told me how unsettled she was. Hearing her voice shake as she repeated Emily's questions made my chest tighten with frustration. Emily had dragged my family into her lies, and she was doing it with a softness that made it seem like she was simply worried. I tried to reassure my mother, but when I hung up the phone, the frustration settled deeper. It was becoming clear that Emily was reaching out to everyone around me, planting seeds before I even understood how far her plan went. She had spoken to neighbors, telling them I came back different. She had hinted to friends that I was unpredictable and overwhelmed. She had even contacted one of the guys from my unit who lived nearby, asking him to check on me because she was afraid I might not be stable. With each message that trickled back to me, I felt my sense of control slipping. I had built a reputation as someone steady under pressure, someone who could handle chaos without losing direction. Now, the person who had shared my home was twisting that strength into something fragile in the eyes of others. Every rumor she put out there chipped away at the version of me people knew, replacing it with a distorted image I barely recognized. What hurt most was knowing she understood exactly how damaging these claims could be. She knew the stigma soldiers faced when it came to mental health and how quickly doubt could spread. She used that knowledge like a weapon, smiling in public while undermining me in private. I felt caught between anger and disbelief, as if each new report about what she had said was another crack in the life I thought we shared. Sitting alone in that quiet apartment, I realized I was fighting a kind of battle I had never trained for. There were no tactics for handling betrayal this personal, no manual for stopping someone who knew every vulnerability you carried. It was the first time I understood that Emily was not just trying to take my home or my business. She was trying to erase the man I was, piece by piece, while pretending to care for my well-being. Emily called me late in the afternoon, her voice warm in a way that felt rehearsed, almost too smooth to be real. She said she wanted to talk, said she wanted us to sit down like adults and clear the air before things got worse. I listened in silence, already feeling the distance between her words and her intentions, but I agreed to meet because I needed to see how far she was willing to take this. When I pulled up to the house that night, the driveway lights were on as if she wanted to create the illusion of welcome. I stepped inside and found the table set with my grandmother's old china, plates we almost never used because Emily once said they looked outdated. The candles were lit, the silverware was polished, and for a brief moment it looked like a celebration instead of a negotiation. As I walked closer, the truth revealed itself in small details. The food on the plates was neatly arranged but carried the unmistakable smell of cheap takeout she had emptied into those dishes. The glossy shine was from plastic containers beneath the surface, not from any effort she had made. She stood in the kitchen smoothing the fabric of the dress I had paid for and tried to greet me with a softness I no longer recognized. Something about her smile felt stretched too tight, like she was wearing a mask she had forgotten how to remove. I slipped my phone into my coat pocket with the recording already running before I even sat down. When we started eating, she began talking in that careful tone she used when she wanted to guide a conversation to her advantage. She mentioned how hard things had been for her, how she had held everything together while I was gone, and how she deserved some security now that our marriage was falling apart. Her words circled around the real point with deliberate ease, and then she pushed a stack of papers toward me. She said she wanted the house to ensure stability. She said she wanted half of the business because she had supported me while I built it. She added that she would need monthly support until she found her footing again. Her voice never shook. She laid out each demand like she was reading a list she had memorized. I kept my eyes on the papers and not on her face because if I looked up, I knew she would see the anger building behind my calm. Instead, I let the silence stretch until she leaned forward, urging me to sign so we could move on. The truth was she had no idea the property and business were protected by premarital documentation she could not touch. I knew the papers she brought held no legal weight, but I also knew the recording of her demands would prove everything she had been trying to hide. My hand stayed steady as I picked up the pen. I signed each page without comment, letting her believe she was winning. Emily watched me with a kind of satisfaction that made the air feel even colder. She thanked me with a softness that felt more insulting than anything she had said earlier, as if I had just agreed to a reasonable compromise instead of offering her the rope she had tied herself with. I placed the signed stack neatly on the table, pushed my chair back, and stood without looking at her. There was nothing left to say that would change what she had already done. I walked out of the house with slow, controlled steps, feeling the night air wrap around me like a barrier between the past and what came next. My pulse was steady, my breathing calm, and for the first time since returning home, I felt something close to clarity. I had given her exactly what she asked for, and she had given me everything I needed to end this on my terms. Captain Brooks met me in a small conference room on base the morning after the dinner, carrying a rigid binder tucked under his arm and a focused look that told me he had already reviewed part of what I sent. He was the kind of officer who spoke only when he had something worth saying, and when he gestured for me to sit, I felt the first steady breath I had taken in days. A few minutes later, Attorney Hale arrived, a civilian lawyer the Army often worked with for complicated cases involving property and contracts. He shook my hand firmly before laying out his laptop and a legal pad covered in notes. The two of them sat across from me like a tactical team preparing for a briefing, and for the first time since coming home, I felt like I was on solid ground again. They started with the recording. Brooks listened with a blank expression while Hale paused every few minutes to jot down details. Hearing Emily's voice through those speakers made my chest tighten, but watching their reactions eased some of that pressure. They both recognized exactly what she had done when she listed her demands and pushed the papers across the table. Hale leaned back and said the recording alone put her in a corner she would not be able to escape. Then Brooks opened the file containing the premarital documents, flipping through them with the same precision he used when reviewing mission orders. The dates were clear, the signatures were valid, and the protections around the house and business were airtight. When he reached the trust papers for my father's cabin, he nodded once and said everything she claimed had no legal standing. The two of them spent the next half hour assembling the information into a strategy. Hale pulled up the contact information for Emily's attorney and asked if I was ready for the next step. I said yes without hesitation. When the call connected, the tone in the room shifted. Emily's attorney began confidently, but that confidence evaporated the moment Hale played a portion of the recording through the speaker. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a sharp change in his voice as he tried to understand why she would make demands that directly contradicted legal documents already on file. Hale calmly walked him through the premarital protections and the trust details until the man had nothing left but frustration. The attorney raised his voice, not at us, but at the situation he suddenly realized he had walked into. He said she had assured him she was entitled to half of everything and that she had told him the property was shared. Hale kept his tone even as he explained that she had misled him and that her signatures on the documents she forced on me only made her case weaker. By the time the call ended, the power in the conversation had shifted entirely. I could feel it settle in the room like a weight lifting from my shoulders. For the first time since coming home, I was no longer reacting. I was taking ground back piece by piece, and she had no idea how quickly her plan was beginning to fall apart. I called the bank the same evening the lawyers wrapped up the call, and I could feel a steady sense of control settling back into my chest as each step was completed. I shut down the joint account first, blocking every connected card and removing her access to anything tied to my name. The representative confirmed the closure, and hearing those words felt like a door finally locking behind me. Then I contacted the credit card company, canceling the cards she used freely while I was overseas. The last step was resetting the credentials for my business portal, something she had tampered with before. When the system notified me that the new password was active, it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself she had tried to distort. By the next morning, Emily was already posting online as if she had won something. She uploaded a polished photo standing in the living room, calling it her fresh start and adding captions about independence. It was the same room I built and furnished, but she posed in it like it belonged to her. The comments were full of people cheering her on, believing the story she had been spreading for weeks. I did not respond. I did not need to. The truth was already moving in silence, far more effective than any argument. That afternoon, Ethan called with something that made the whole picture even clearer. He said he had a friend in private security who pulled footage from a delivery lot near our neighborhood. The video showed Emily loading boxes into the trunk of her car long before she served me papers. The timestamp proved she had been removing my belongings in small batches, making sure not to draw attention. Watching her lift boxes filled with things I recognized, things she had no reason to touch, brought a cold kind of clarity. She had been stealing from me before she even pretended to negotiate. The fallout started faster than I expected. Emily went to her usual coffee shop, and her card was declined right there at the counter. Someone on the patio recorded the moment she stepped aside and checked her phone with confusion spreading across her face. By the time she walked out, her forced confidence was slipping. Later that day, neighbors began messaging me with questions. Emily had been telling them I abandoned her, but now they were seeing cracks in her story. One neighbor mentioned seeing her moving boxes for weeks and wondered why she told them I was the one who walked out without warning. Piece by piece, the image she built was coming apart. I did not have to expose her. She was doing it herself, unraveling with every lie that no longer matched the reality around her. Taking back what was mine did not feel like revenge. It felt like restoring balance after someone had tilted my entire life off its axis. The call from her attorney came early in the morning, letting me know the decision had been made. Emily had 72 hours to leave the house, and there would be no extensions or negotiations. Hearing those words felt unreal for a moment because everything had moved so fast, but beneath the surprise was a calm sense of finality. When I drove to the house that afternoon, her brother was already there with the trunk of his car open. He served in the reserves and carried himself with the same quiet discipline most of us shared. He did not meet my eyes at first, but when he finally did, there was a tired honesty in his expression. He helped her pack without complaint and kept his voice low, as if he did not want her to hear him admit that she had been heading for this outcome for a long time. I stayed outside while they loaded her bags, watching the last pieces of her life in that house disappear into the back of a small hatchback. There were no dramatic scenes, no shouting, no attempts at bargaining. She avoided looking at me, and I felt no need to force any final conversation. When the car finally pulled out of the driveway, the silence left behind felt different from any silence I had known in months. It was clean and open, not heavy or tense. For the first time since returning from deployment, I felt like I could breathe without bracing for whatever came next. That evening, I changed the locks on every door, moving through the house one room at a time. The clicks of each new lock sliding into place felt like anchors being set. I opened the windows and let fresh air move through the rooms, carrying out whatever trace of tension had settled there. Light shifted across the floors as the sun moved, and the house felt larger, like the walls had expanded with the pressure gone. I walked through each room slowly, letting the quiet rebuild itself into something peaceful rather than empty. It struck me how long it had been since I recognized my own home. 6 months later, the backyard was filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of grilled food. My closest soldiers stood around the grill, trading stories like we always did when life finally gave us room to relax. My mother brought dishes from her old recipes, and Ethan joked with Marcus near the fence. The house behind us looked whole again, not because of anything new I had added, but because there was no longer a shadow hanging over it. My business was steady, my routine was grounded, and I felt clearer than I had in years. As the sun set, I stepped back to take in the scene. Everyone there had seen me at my worst and stayed long enough to see me climb out of it. In that moment, I understood something I had been trying to avoid. Sometimes the person closest to you is the one who blindsides you the hardest, and sometimes that is what it takes to finally wake up. I lost something I thought was part of my future, but I gained a piece I had not realized I was missing, and that piece felt like the first real victory after a long war.